Welcome to the reading lecture for English 101 Rhetoric 1, Week 7. I'm going to keep this one pretty brief because we'll have a little more on the rhetoric side this week. But we are going to start reading a famous story called Barn Burning by Haruki Murakami. He's a Japanese author. This story is loosely based on, or maybe inspired is a better word, on a William Faulkner story, who was an American writer from the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And Murakami was kind of influenced by that. There's also a fairly recent movie just called Burning that was also, so there's kind of this chain of artists which I like in this story, going back to William Faulkner in the US, to Murakami in Japan writing the short story, to the filmmaker making the Korean filmmaker making Lee Chung-dong making the movie Burning. So these are just some things we're going to talk about with this reading, but let's get into the actual reading. And again, this is a little ways out in terms of us actually writing about this, but to stay up with all the readings that we're doing, it's important that we start this reading soon, even though you're not going to be writing about this for one or two more papers. This will be near the end of not the end of the semester, but after midterm. So in this story, there are important characters, and I would say there are three that you really want to focus on. So as you read through the first part, you don't have to read the whole story. It's a fairly long story, but if you read the first part this week, start to look for those characters. You'll see right away who the important characters are, and there are three. Maybe this is what we call a love triangle, which you've probably heard of that before. Where and when does the story take place? What events have already taken place? So the narrator is going to give us some information. We're going to have a narrator, but see if you can kind of get a sense of, is a Japanese writer, Murakami, so you get probably a feeling as you're reading this. Maybe they don't say explicitly they're in Japan, but imagine the story is written in Japanese, translated into English. So, you will get that sense, hopefully. And if you can try to figure out the time period, is it modern? Is it the 1600s? Or, when is this taking place? You don't have to have the exact year, but to have a sense of it. If you want to look at the publication of the story, the date, then you would know something about, at least it was before that. And again, the language, it's a little different when you're reading a story in translation, but we hope that the translator did a great job of getting the intent and including the language and the symbolism and the figurative language, whether it's simple or complex or conversational. So look at the language as you read through it, just as you would even if it were a story that was originally written in English. Who's telling the story? Obviously, you want to figure out who your main character is, your narrator or your protagonist. And are they using first person, second person, third person as you read through the story? In the universal themes, responsibility and freedom are two that I'm going to just throw out there and see. As you read this, do you see that there's some emphasis by the writer trying to maybe ask us to think about how we maybe are or are not responsible for those people around us, whether they're our close friends and family or just someone we know from work or an acquaintance or someone we date or something like that. That is, I think, some of the big questions or universal themes that will come up. But I don't want to say too much about it because I want you to enjoy reading the story. I was talking with students last week about this idea of spoiler alerts, but then also something called trigger warnings, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with trigger warnings. I honestly was not too familiar, but I was visiting another English class and they were talking about this in that class. And I thought it was very interesting. I'll just say generally, most of the stories that we read, they're pretty serious. They're literary stories. So don't be surprised. I mean, I don't want to offend anyone, but I don't like to give trigger warnings because I don't want to spoil the story for you. But all the stories that we read, if you look back, obviously, Edison, New Jersey, maybe there wasn't anything just strikingly serious, but there were some things that maybe could be triggering. Certainly, A Temporary Matter, written by John Lahiri, we looked at that, and so that could, we have the death of a child, a miscarriage. That could be. So again, maybe I should have mentioned this at the beginning of this semester, but I'm doing it now because as we read through I was just made aware of this recently and something I hadn't really thought about too much. But again, I want to err on the side of I don't want to ruin the story for you and tell you that there's going to be this tragedy or this thing's going to happen. And in this story, in fact, it's really up to you, the reader, to decide in a way, because I think there's a lot of ambiguity or ambivalence. It's kind of like, is something really bad happening here or not? So again, I'll leave it up to you, but not a trigger warning, but just to let you know, the stories that we're reading are serious literary stories for the most part, because I think it's challenging to you as a reader. And so don't be surprised if some really important or even disturbing themes do come up. But So I'll stop there, but there are some themes coming up in this one. A couple of things with the reading summary. I just want to throw out with our reading summary questions for week 7. What do you think the narrator feels about the girl he describes? So this is an important part of the story. Again, talking about how we are responsible for people, or how we respond to other people, or think of other people. But you might want to try to get a sense of, as you're reading, are they just friends, or is there something else going on between them? And what does that look like? He does say he met her at the wedding party of an acquaintance, and we got friendly. Now, again, we talk about using language that we got friendly. That can mean a lot of things. And remember, this is translated from Japanese, so he might be trying to be kind of the way he uses language here may be important. So that's on page 132. Don't worry, it's not a 130-page story. It's coming from a collection of stories, so but the page numbers I left the original page numbers in there. So anyway, think about these questions as you go through. Here's another one from the reading summary questions. The woman's new boyfriend seems to have a lot of money. So we get these two boyfriends, a new one and then the old one, but neither the woman nor the narrator knows how he makes his money. Do you think it's suspicious when someone has a lot of money but no one knows how they got it? Why or why not? So here's just a question, and this is just coming from the narrator. The guy's got to be loaded, I ventured to comment to her once. Yeah, she said without much interest, I guess. So she's not too worried about it, but that seems like the old boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend is, or whatever their relationship was. It's a little complicated, as you'll see when you get into it. And finally, if a friend of yours was dating someone you thought was dangerous, would you feel comfortable warning your friend? Explain why or why not. Sometimes we don't want to get involved. Maybe it's none of my business, I feel like, especially if I'm not a super close friend. But here's a question related to this. And does she know about this? I asked, pointing upstairs. Not a thing. Fact is, I've never told her anything about this but you. So there's a scene in the story you'll see where the narrator is hanging out with the former girlfriend and the new boyfriend, and the new boyfriend confides something really bad. It sounds really bad that he's doing illegal, and but he says he's never told the girl. So anyway, this is our story. Our next story we're going to look at, again, it's called Barn Burning, and it's an interesting story. And if you really want to know a different perspective on this whole story, I really highly recommend the Korean film. I'm not going to show it in class because it's just a little too graphic, I think. And there's a trigger warning for you, by the way. If you do go watch Burning, I will certainly give you a trigger warning on that. There's murder, there's a lot of sexual content, violence, disturbing stuff, So I will give you a trigger warning on that movie because we're not using that for class per se. But I also will give you a high recommendation of the film if you can stand and read subtitles, because it's a Korean movie. It's going to be in Korean. All right, so let's see. Last thing is this article that we're reading this week has to do with domestic violence. And of course, you might see how this is going to tie in with our story and later going to tie into our first essay. So here's just a few questions on that. And that's all we have for this week. I hope everybody has a great week. As always, send me any questions or concerns you might have through email. It's the best way to reach me, or visit my office hours. Thanks.